Welcome to the podcast where we explore the issues shaping today's workplaces and the experiences of the people in them. We're your hosts, Rachelle Beers, HR Manager, and Amanda Rojas, HR Business Partner. And today we're diving into a topic that continues to evolve and remains critically important, and that is workplace harassment and discrimination. And we're not just going to define it and call it a day. We're actually breaking it down from two sides. So part one will be what employees need to know, and part two will be what employers really need to get right. Most workplace issues, I don't really believe, start with bad intentions. They start instead usually with an act of poor judgment or a misunderstanding, which can then lead to awkward situations, avoidance, or someone thinking, this probably isn't that big of a deal. But actually, sometimes it is a big deal or can turn into one if not handled correctly from the start. And so whether you're an employee wondering, should I say something? Or an employer hoping, we're probably just fine, this episode is for you. So let's get into it.
All right, let's start with what employees need to know, and specifically what counts as harassment or discrimination.
Yeah, I think that's a really good place to start because I think this is where most people get tripped up. When you hear words like harassment, hostile work environment, discrimination, what are some of the things that you picture?
I definitely think most employers go with extreme cases. And employees' thoughts run the gamut from situations that just make them feel uncomfortable to situations like sexual assault happening at work. But in reality, harassment is any unwelcome behavior tied to or motivated by a person's legally protected characteristics like race, gender, religion, age, disability, even military status or pregnancy. Discrimination occurs when those characteristics are the basis for employment decisions, things like hiring, promotions, or pay.
Yeah, that's right. Protected classes or protected characteristics must be the basis of an action taken by a company or an individual for true harassment or discrimination to have taken place. And I think it's really helpful for employees to understand this and know the difference between a violation of culture and company policy versus a violation of the law. This way they can better understand what just happened and the kind of outcome they should expect from their employer. So maybe just an example. Let's say you have a manager that yells at all the employees, calling them stupid, terrible people, and really any bad thing you can imagine. Okay. But it's pretty general. Just, basically you guys are terrible. You're terrible at your job. You're terrible people, things like that. In that case, even though that seems really extreme, and it is, you likely have a policy or culture violation. If instead you have a manager that's targeting individuals of a particular protected class, yells at them, calls them names, makes unfavorable employment decisions toward them, even though they perform as well as everyone else, now we have a much bigger problem. In the first case, we have what we like to call an equal opportunity jerk, right? Somebody who targets everyone with unprofessional and bad behavior. But in the second case, we have a person in a position of authority creating a hostile environment and making employment decisions based on a person's protected characteristics. So in the first case, a company could decide, not that we would recommend this at all, but they could decide to allow the manager to continue berating employees until they quit and move on, right? Generally, it's at-will employment. I can decide to leave my company for any reason or no reason at all. My company can decide that they want to part ways with me for any reason or no reason at all. So again, terrible practice. I don't recommend it. That would be a horrible culture to work in. But in the second case, the company needs to take action and immediately take steps to stop the harassing and discriminatory actions of that manager, or they're going to face serious consequences. So the first is probably a violation of policy and culture, but the second is a potential violation of the law.
For sure. So going off that example, let's answer the question, am I overreacting? Employee comes, they're having that situation where they feel that the employer is discriminating against them, say, by yelling at them. Are they overreacting? It comes up all the time, and it's usually followed by, it wasn't that bad.
Yeah, Exactly. I think we see that all the time where when all of a sudden something gets to the point where we're faced with the decision to either report it or confront a situation. A lot of us, our first response is to start backpedaling because confrontation is so uncomfortable.
It is. And it's so common for employees to do that. But if something consistently makes you uncomfortable and it's reasonable to ask that the behavior stops, you should really pay attention as the employee. Watch for patterns of behavior. Recognize those patterns of behavior and feel okay going and talking to someone about them. One comment or an odd encounter might be easy to brush off, and that's usually not a big deal. But if the behavior is, it should catch your attention, especially if you've asked that person to stop and the behavior continues. So to answer the question, am I overreacting? Say it out loud, write it down, just write down the facts of what's going on so that you can look at it yourself and say, okay, is this something I should be concerned about or not?
Yeah, I like that. Those are really good questions to ask. In HR, we often talk about the reasonable person standard, and that's because we deal with subjective circumstances all the time. So let's use another example and maybe talk it through in terms of, what is reasonable. I think it's really hard sometimes to make these judgment calls and know, like, gosh, should I say something? Is it reasonable to ask that my company help me with this? I don't know. So let's say, for example, you have a brand new coworker who was just hired. Let's say you all work in a warehouse and it's a male and you're female. And it doesn't have to be that way, but that's just this particular scenario. And let's say the guy is really big, like 6'4", super muscular, tattoos everywhere, quiet, kind of a serious demeanor, not really like friendly. And you're really nervous to be around him. He reminds you of somebody maybe in your past that you don't like, or that maybe you have some even like trauma experience in the past. I don't know. But this individual makes you really, really nervous. And let's say he works the same shift as you in the warehouse. And, maybe from time to time you find yourself alone or nearly alone with them as you both end the day and head out to the parking lot. And let's say, too, that at this point you haven't really interacted with him much and he hasn't interacted with you. You're kind of avoiding him. But again, you're feeling nervous, unsafe, and you want to avoid being near this person, but you guys are working in the same department. And you start to feel tempted to leave early and race out to your car before this individual comes and is near you and walks out with you, or maybe ask for a transfer or ask that he be moved to a different shift, or find some way to make the company make it so you don't have to interact with them. So, Amanda, if an employee brought this to you, what do you think? How would you approach this situation? Like, what questions would you ask? What do you think?
First, you want to make sure that that employee is comfortable, but we have to look at what's actually going on. So asking questions like, okay, what makes you feel nervous? Has anything actually happened? Has he said something? Trying to get them to evaluate what is making them nervous. Are there things, you're already working the same shift. Can that really reasonably be changed if nothing is actually going on? So really ask those questions to get them to think about whether this is something that actually needs to be addressed on a employer level, or what we can do to actually make them feel more comfortable.
Yeah, I mean, if we can do something and we can be sensitive to the employee without disrupting everything, well, I mean, possibly, I think your employer might consider that. But do they have to? That's a good question. If you feel comfortable, I think in a situation like that, it could make sense to talk to your employer and say, hey, this is what's going on. I feel uncomfortable. I know it's a me thing. This person, and acknowledge this person hasn't done anything wrong. I just feel uncomfortable, and maybe it's something that I need to figure out and deal with on my own. But if there were a way to easily put me in a different situation so that we weren't interacting, I would appreciate it. I think that's very reasonable to come to your manager or your employer that way. But with the understanding that unless there's something material going on, it's probably not reasonable to make your employer or expect that your employer is going to fix this for you.
Okay.
Let's say instead, just sticking with scenarios here, let's say instead you have a coworker that's a big hugger, or someone that likes to come around the corner and jump scare you or sneak up behind you at your desk and startle you. I don't know if you've ever had someone like that. Is it reasonable to ask that to stop? I
Yeah,
would say, yeah, right?
absolutely.
I think this is something like jump scaring or hugging somebody in the workplace. That is unnecessary. It is not related to furthering work goals, and I think could make a reasonable person feel uncomfortable.
I think you're exactly right, Rachelle. Someone saying I was joking, sure, they might feel like they were joking, but the impact is important. And if the impact was negative to the person that, they jump scared, then that's more important than the person's intent. So we want to make sure that we keep that in mind. While that person may have a good intent in giving you a hug, if the other employee is not comfortable with that, then they have every right to say, hey, I would prefer that you don't give me hugs. If you do bring that to your employer, just know that as the employee, you have a right to make a complaint in good faith. It is your right to do so, even if it turns out it was just a misunderstanding, like with the first case we were talking about, where you were just uncomfortable with that person. Nothing has happened, but you still have a right to talk to your employer about it.
Yeah, I like that a lot. And the thing that is kind of a key difference between these two scenarios, I think, is that in the one case, with the person who's hugging or jump scaring, that employee has total power to
Mm-hmm.
stop that behavior. They're actually doing something that's bothering or offending someone else. In the first example, the individual hadn't done anything. I don't know that a person can control necessarily just having an intimidating demeanor, right? In and of itself. Yeah, like, so I think also just if somebody is in control of being able to stop that behavior or do something different. I think that's a key consideration too when we're deciding, like, is this something I should say something about?
Absolutely. I think the employee needs to understand what they're seeing and what they're feeling so that they can take that to whatever degree it needs to go to. So, what should you do as the employee? If you feel that way, if you feel uncomfortable, if you have someone, coming up and giving you hugs, what should you do next? So, let's get into that a little bit. If something does happen to you that you believe should not be happening in the workplace, step one is to address it directly so that if you feel safe enough to do that. We have what we call the stop method, and that's state what behavior you find offensive, tell them how it impacts you or others, offer a replacement behavior, and preview consequences if the behavior continues. So this is a great way, if you feel comfortable addressing it directly, this is a great way for you to try to get that behavior to stop. Someone comes up and hugs you, you ask them to stop, you tell them it makes you feel uncomfortable, you can offer a replacement behavior, say, hey, let's high five when we see each other instead of hugging, something like that. So just going through that process. If you do not feel comfortable directly addressing them, or let's say the behavior continues and turns into a pattern that's so egregious that it has to be reported. In that case, run it up the leadership chain. Follow your company's complaint process. We'd also suggest you save any evidence to verify what's happening. Emails, messages, notes, anything you have. Save the times, the dates, the witnesses. Make sure you have that information so that you can report it to your employer, your manager, supervisor. Once you do that, then it will be investigated. If you feel like your direct supervisor or your manager is the issue, you can absolutely go around them. Take it to the next higher up.
Yeah, that's awesome. And so evidence is really critical. I like that you brought that in. If something is bothering you and don't delete those text messages that you find inappropriate. Don't delete those things. If you have anything like emails, messages, even just jotting down what happened and keeping a good timeline, I think is really, really important when we go in to investigate. One thing I also wanted to say, Amanda, you talked about the direct approach if you feel safe enough. That's the kindest thing that we can do, I think, for any coworker. If we can, I know that it can be really uncomfortable to talk to somebody directly and say, "Hey, this is bothering me. I don't like this. Can you stop this? This is how it makes me feel." That is the kindest thing that you could do. I would so much rather have somebody just tell me that I'm doing something that's bothering them rather than running it up the chain in the first place. But again, if it's really egregious or you don't feel safe, that is not a requirement. You can always have somebody help you in those conversations. But
Yeah.
so let's talk about bystanders a little bit. You don't necessarily have to be the target to object to something happening in the workplace. Sometimes it's stuff that we see. And if you see something that violates policy or culture that you're concerned with, as an employee, you have every right to say something, and you should, even if the situation has nothing to do with you directly. And you can use your company's complaint procedure. I think it's really important to emphasize that employees have the right to make good faith complaints to the proper person within the organization. Okay. You don't have the right to spread gossip everywhere. You don't have the right to lie and be dishonest about other employees. You don't have the right to start rumors or badmouth everybody in the organization with no intent to solve the issue. Or to do that to people who can't help you solve the problem at all. You don't have those rights because that can create basically just a toxic work environment. And so I think that's a really important distinction, but you do absolutely have the right to make good faith complaints to the proper person in your organization with the intent to resolve it.
100%. Kind of along that same track, let's talk about the number one reason that employees delay reporting or they don't report at all. It's fear of retaliation. So retaliation is 100% illegal. If you're afraid of bringing your good faith complaint to your employer because of retaliation, just know that there are legal protections for you. Again, as Rachelle said, that is not spreading gossip. That's not spreading lies. These are good faith complaints about harassment or discrimination in the workplace. It's always illegal for retaliation. But that doesn't mean that an employee should fear going to their employer with their complaint. This is one of the reasons that we highly recommend documenting your complaint, like we were talking about, keeping those text messages, writing down the dates and the times that things happened so that you can make that formal complaint to the right people in your organization. And then when reporting or confronting issues, we know it's hard, we know it's uncomfortable. Maybe you've tried approaching it directly already and you've already had the uncomfortableness of that, and now you have to go and report it to your employer. We get that that's hard, but it is absolutely important. We want to make sure that you as the employee are protected. If you're seeing something and reporting, discrimination for another employee, you're helping that employee to be protected also. And overall, you're going to make your company culture better. You're going to improve it. You're going to make it a safer and better environment for everybody.
Yeah, I love that. I think it takes everyone. Sometimes I think when we work in an organization, we don't really think about how much culture depends on every single one of us, and that leadership can't do it alone. They can't. I mean, I think good culture comes from the top down. It absolutely does. But without employees and good people who are, willing to say something, willing to involve themselves in an investigation and wanting that right outcome, it can fall apart pretty quickly. So I think that's really important. And one other point that I wanted to make is that even a good faith complaint doesn't protect an employee from accountability for performance issues or policy violations. We're talking a little bit here about retaliation and what it is, but also let's talk about what it isn't. Let's say somebody has, some significant performance issues that have been addressed, and their company or their manager has, talked to them multiple times about it. Let's say it's coming in late, right? Something like that. And this employee also happens to have an issue with another employee, and they feel like they're being harassed or discriminated against, and the employee makes a complaint. Your policy violations or performance issues are separate. Those are two completely different things. An employer can still hold you accountable for your actions and your reactions to situations, and your job performance before, during, and after you make a complaint. That is not retaliation. Retaliation is when they make employment decisions because you made that complaint, or you find that the person you're accusing or coming against finds out that you're the complainant, and then the situation gets worse, right? It doesn't get better, it gets worse. The harassment gets worse. Let's say it's somebody in a position of power, and now all of a sudden they transfer you to some terrible location where there's no way you're going to get the sales that you can get in your current location. Like, they cause some kind of a job detriment. That is retaliation. Mm-hmm. But I do think it's important, even if you're dealing with something really difficult at work, that your behavior is in line with policies such as call-out procedures, treatment of other people, and professionalism at all times. That way the focus stays where it needs to, and that's on your complaint.
Absolutely.
So let's talk about just maybe a few common misconceptions. Amanda, give us maybe a reality check here, or a few takeaways that we can remember from this first part.
Yeah. So a few takeaways. Remember, not everything uncomfortable is illegal harassment. We have this nice gray zone between illegal harassment and a super safe, healthy work environment. And so many things fall into that gray zone. If it's uncomfortable, absolutely, like we talked about, evaluate. Why is that uncomfortable for you? But remember, it may not be falling into illegal harassment and discrimination. So we want to make sure that we're thinking about that we're looking at it by a reasonable person standard that Rachelle talked earlier. We want to make sure that, okay, this situation, any reasonable person would see it as harassment, or a reasonable person may not see it as harassment. So make sure we're thinking about that. Another point would be that not everything has to be illegal to be unacceptable. We want that healthy workplace culture. So the more we can get out of that gray zone and to a good, healthy culture where people talk to each other, they talk and say, hey, I'm not comfortable with this. Can we please do something else? That makes everything so much better for your company. Again, if you're not comfortable directly approaching someone, absolutely take it to your manager. But just because it's not illegal does not mean it's acceptable. We want to make sure that we're doing our best to have a good policy and a good culture in our company. The last key takeaway I would say today is that as an employer and as the employee, use good judgment, professional behavior, and make sure to respect your company, respect each other as employees, and respect your employers. That should always be the baseline for the company culture, not just the legal minimum.
Awesome. Yep, I agree. If all we ever did was try to avoid the legal line, wow, that is a low bar. So we for sure want to have a much higher bar and expectation of ourselves as leaders and employees. So that's a wrap on part one. Next, we're going to talk about what employers really need to get right.